from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is the first of an internal mini-series of 1930s science fiction. I'm going to be doing a whole series devoted to science fiction that came from the decade before World War II. This was an important era for science fiction, which we'll get into. But today we're focusing on one author who's very special to me, and one of her earliest, I think her first big professional sales, Shambleau. And this, of course, is Catherine Lucille Moore, more often known as C.L. Moore. And we'll get into C.L. Moore, into this history here in a little bit, but let's introduce our panel. Coming from across the ocean to your brain holes is Cora Buhlert, who I have podcasted with before, but this is her first time on Postcards. She was on Dickheads with me when we talked about Lee Brackett's amazing The Big Jump, which of course was Do-Si-Do with Philip K. Dick's original first debut novel, Solar Lottery. So definitely go check out that episode if you haven't, because Lee Brackett is important to the C.L. Moore story as well. Cora, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thanks for having me.
And you just got off another podcast talking about Robert E. Howard, so you're already in the mindset of the Weird Tales era, and excited that you could be here. Greg Cox has been on Postcards before. He was on our tribute episode to Richard Matheson, who Greg served as Richard Matheson's editor at Tor Books in the later part of his career. And so definitely go back and check out that Richard Matheson episode, because that one's great too. But Greg is I believe, New York Times bestselling author, because he's written a whole bunch of media tie-ins. So many. He's written more. Well, first of all, he's written multiple Star Trek novels inspired by single sentences from Star Trek to the Wrath of Khan, which I think is a really impressive thing, that you've turned sentences from Star Trek into novels. But Greg, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Now, you collected Shambleau in a book, so we'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah, Tomorrow Sucks, and that's where you collected it. But first, we're going to just talk about C.L. Moore, the person. And she has a special meaning to me because she is from the state of Indiana. In fact, she was born in Indianapolis, the same city that is most famous for producing Kurt Vonnegut, as far as writers go, which is great, but I like me some C.L. Moore here. So, and she also went to IU, which is the school my father taught at. So one of the cool things that I discovered was that the dorm she lived in was literally a 5 or 10 minute walk from the house that I grew up in. Wow. Yeah, which is pretty cool. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But she was born in 1911. And, basically she was going to college in the Great Depression era. And that's why before she even declared a major at IU, she was, had to go and had to leave. And but you know what, this might be a good time to show the pictures, and feel free to jump in, especially Cora. I know you really like the history of these people, and let's see. So first, this is C.L. Moore. I believe this is a picture of her from the 40s, but I'm not entirely certain of that. But what's really cool is that I did find a picture of her dorm. This is Memorial Hall.
Oh, I've never seen that one.
Yeah, this is Memorial Hall. This was the dorm that she lived in. It's a part of what's called the Wells Quad now at IU. and it's surrounded by classroom buildings now. It's not a section of the campus that's known for dorms. And mostly the interior of the buildings has been kind of redone to be classroom space and laboratory space. So it's not a dorm anymore. But at the time, by the way, one of the closest things on campus, now you can see IU, one of the things about IU is that Indiana University is very close to a bunch of limestone quarries. And that's why the entire campus is almost entirely limestone. That wall you see in the front is still there on 3rd Avenue. And that's one of the major thoroughfares of Bloomington. And so there's constantly traffic going by there. And the building is built out on the left and the right and makes a quad going the other direction, going north. And this is a south view of Memorial Hall. And one of the things that was really close to there that I think everyone should be interested in with C.L. Moore, and I think is really interesting, is the Kirkwood Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical observatories in Indiana that's still standing, was very close to Memorial Hall. It was in walking distance, and they regularly during the 20s and 30s, according to my research, looking up the department website, is that they would routinely do astro parties during that era. And so it's a good chance that C.L. Moore was looking at the stars through the observatory. I mean, there's nothing, she didn't write anything about it, but it's possible. Now, this is what the dorm rooms at Memorial Hall look like. This is one of the lounges at the top. And then the bottom, that's what the rooms look like in Memorial Hall in the 20s and 30s.
It actually looks pretty nice for a student dorm. At least, I don't know what they normally look like in the US these days, but I've seen European ones which look worse nowadays.
Right, and Memorial Hall was the first women's dormitory at IU, the very first one. So, which is pretty cool. And then, let's see. Yeah, well, we'll have some other ones later to look at, some pictures later. But she ended up leaving IU because of the Great Depression and not having, she had to go back to work, and she ended up getting married. I think she had a first marriage before Henry Kuttner.
No, I think they were engaged, but they did not get to marry because because the man, he was a co-worker, he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, which might be either suicide or, she always said it was an accident, but apparently coroner's report, someone dug up, said it was suicide.
Well, that's an interesting note that I did not know. Yeah, so
Bobby, do you know Bobby Deary? He ducks this up.
Okay, gotcha. And she was at IU through the fall of 1929 to the fall of 1930. At IU, she published her first 3 stories in the Vagabond, which is the still running IU literary journal. The online Vagabond journal has these stories. You can read them online. I did this weekend.
It's good to know. I didn't know that the first 3 stories were available.
Yes, and the first one, Happily Ever After, is kind of a funny twist on Cinderella. I'm not going to say anything more about it, but I do think it's very interesting. So if you look up IU Vagabond online archives, you can even Google, you can put C.L. Moore in the Google window, and they come up fairly quickly, and they're there. You can read them. Happily Ever After is really kind of a satirical like bent on Cinderella, but it also has a little bit of a kind of feminist take. I don't want to say any more, but I think people should read it for themselves. But that was the first thing she ever published, the first story. And other than that, the other stories were just kind of, the other 2 stories that she published there were just kind of literary stories. Now, originally when I wrote my review of this book, I assumed that she had written Shambleau when she was living in the dorms, but that's not the case, or it doesn't seem to be the case, because she was there in 1930. I thought she was there later. The story was likely written in 32 or 33. And so she was working in Indianapolis at the time at the at a bank, which is the Fletcher.
Fletcher Trust Corporation. It's in company or corporation. I don't
Yeah.
remember the last, but it's Fletcher Trust.
Fletcher
I just
Trust.
wrote an article about her, so it's still on the top of my mind.
Right.
Yes,
Now-
I reviewed the Wikipedia article on her this morning. Okay.
Right. And the Fletcher Trust building, which was at the time the tallest building in Indianapolis, and it's still one of the tallest, is now currently a Hilton Garden Inn. So when you go to Indiana on your Kurt Vonnegut, C.L. Moore trip, and you see the Captain Janeway statue in Bloomington, by the way. So I'm setting up a trip here to Indiana that you are all going to want to do. You can stay at the building she worked in, the Hilton Garden Inn, and the outside of the building looks exactly the same as it did.
I hope they have a memorial plaque or something for her inside or outside.
I don't know if they do or not, but that's something we can
They
work on.
should. They absolutely should.
Yeah. And that's something we could work on. Also, but now I will say IU does claim her for her 1 year that she was there and publishing, and you'll see a lot on IU history websites that they talk about C.L. Moore as being a pioneer of science fiction that went to IU. And
distinguished alumni of 1 year.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I mean, she probably would have finished if it wasn't for, if it wasn't for the Great Depression and all that. And she really didn't have the money. And a lot of people don't realize that the reason why she didn't go by the name C.L. Moore to hide her gender, she did it because there were lots of rules about having multiple jobs and getting benefits and things like that during the Great Depression, because if you were making other money, they would cut her hours at work because they would give her hours to other people. So she didn't want her hours cut at work. So that's why she went under the name C.L. Moore. And by the way, I'm serious about this trip to Indiana. I think people should do it. Now, I'm not just saying this because it's my home state and hometown. The Kurt Vonnegut Museum is incredible, and you can go on tours of Kurt Vonnegut's childhood home. And if anybody reaches out to me, I'll give you all the information of where you can go to the C.L. Moore stuff, because that's going to be a little harder to track down, but you can do that. And while you do that, like I said, the Captain Janeway statue is in Bloomington, because Bloomington is not only where C.L. Moore went to college, but it's Captain Janeway's future hometown. And they built a statue for Catherine Janeway that has
I love that they do this in the US, that they have statues for fictional, also for Star Trek characters. We do have statues for fictional characters, but they're like characters from 19th century literature or something. We have a couple in my hometown for fictional characters. But the Ochin Aldag from the early 20th century, local writer. It's not a Star Trek character. I don't think a single. We don't, of course. I don't think a single character of Space Patrol Orion, it was not Germany's, but it premiered within 10 days after the original Star Trek, and there's a lot of similarities.
Well,
but
and I will say,
a character of them has got a statue. One of the actors actually has a memorial plaque, because he lived his final years near where I live, so I've seen the plaque, but it's for the actor, not for the character.
Yeah, here in America, Lucy has a statue. Samantha Stevens from Bewitched has a statue.
I kind of like this because it's fun. I've seen one for Captain America in Brooklyn, where Steve Rogers supposedly lives. But I think it's fun because over here it's mostly, it's a statue of Bismarck, and here we have one of Kaiser Wilhelm and the other Kaiser Wilhelm and Kaiser Friedrich and so on, who only ruled for 99 days, but the guy got a lot of statues for that. For ruling for 99 days.
Well, we were lucky in Bloomington that we had two really, really active, awesome Star Trek fans, and Mary Beth and Peter, who really raised all the money and all that. And I do know Kate Mulgrew is actually visiting the statue for the first time in October.
I saw that was happening.
Yeah,
that's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah. Well, we have a fine nerd tradition in Bloomington. Okay. So
university town has nerds usually.
So C.L. Moore was one of the reasons why she was such a reader and writer is that when she was young, she got very sick, and she was ill a lot, which is a story that is familiar to me as a PKD person, because Philip K. Dick, that's the reason why he read a lot. That's the reason why Walter Tevis read a lot. So
Bram Stoker was a sickly child who read a lot. Yes.
Yeah. And so this is a common theme with a lot of these sickly kids who sat around reading science fiction magazines and became the same thing. And by the way, Walter Tevis also in the region in Kentucky, but a few years later.
Where in Kentucky?
Yeah, Kentucky is right below Indiana.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, whereabouts? Which place? Which part of Kentucky? Which town?
Well,
do you know?
actually,
Because I have family in Kentucky.
Lexington is where he ended up.
Yeah, that's where my family lives.
Yeah.
That's where relatives. I still have family in Lexington, and I've visited.
Tevis, I think, lived.
I never made it to Indiana. Never made it further north. We only went south. We never went north towards Ohio or Indiana.
Well, now you have
probably for some other time.
Yeah, it's not a far drive for you if you go to Lexington to visit C.L. Moore sites. So probably just a couple hours. So C.L. Moore, she was ill a lot. She did a lot of reading, so she read a lot of fantasy. She read a lot of science fiction. She was clearly, now there's no one's going to convince me that she wasn't reading weird tales all the time before writing this, because she nailed the weird tales voice like right away with Shambleau. So the whole cosmic horror thing, she knew what she was doing as far as like, I'm going to place a story in Weird Tales and I'm going to write it for Weird Tales. It's very clear to me. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I think
it's very much the Weird Tales style of the late 20s and 1930s. It's also I always found it hard to believe that this was her first story, and of course it wasn't. She had those 3 stories in the Vagabond, and it's because it feels very, very developed for the first story written by a woman who would have been 22 or 23 years old at the time.
Right. Now, Weird Tales at the time was edited by Farnsworth Wright, who was the second editor of Weird Tales, I believe. He was, I don't remember who was
there
before.
Was someone before him, Edward Bird. Weird Tales only had 3, or maybe there were 2 before him. There were 2. There was one who didn't last long. Then there was Farnsworth Wright, all the way up to 1940, and then there was Dorothy McIlrace all the way up to the end.
Right. And so here's the thing about Farnsworth Wright is that he was a very serious editor. And if even for his authors that were very popular and very, regular voices, whether it was Robert E. Howard, whether it was Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, or C.L. Moore, he was very willing to reject their stories if he didn't like them. And so he had for example, he rejected At the Mountains of Madness very famously. And a lot of these stories ended up going to Astounding. And so C.L. Moore very quickly established herself writing for Astounding Science Fiction as well. So it wasn't that she was in the stable at Weird Tales, and she was one of the more popular writers at Weird Tales, but she was not exclusive there. So,
and of course, she eventually defected completely to Astounding, along with Henry Kuttner.
Right. And
because Astounding paid a lot better than Weird Tales, and they actually did pay promptly.
Yeah, right. And her most famous story and character probably, now, Shambleau is a story about Northwest Smith, and we'll get more into him when we get into the story, but her most famous character was the I'm gonna always say it wrong. Jarell of Jaree stories. Yep, there. Greg's holding it up for those on YouTube. And and Jarell of Jaree.
This is my copy.
Yeah, probably the most famous story of those is The Black God's Kiss, which is also collected recently in The Future is Female, but it's collected all over the place. And these stories are very Robert E. Howard, very swordswoman adventure type stories. They're great. They're really, really good. I personally like the Northwest Smith stories a little bit more because I like the space rogue thing a little bit more. But and this collection, Northwest of Earth, which from the Golden Age Masterworks that I recently read, I picked up at Powell's, and I was really impressed. Powell's had these new on the shelf, like a stack of them, when I was in Portland. And for $6.98, by the way, was the cost. And they had a stack of these on the shelf. And so I was really impressed that they were carrying C.L. Moore in this book. It wasn't just like a random used book that was in there. They were very clearly ordered and on the shelf. And I appreciated that. Black God's Kiss is probably her most famous one and was the one that was most popular in Weird Tales. From what I could tell,
it was the second most popular story. It was the most popular story of that year, and the second most popular in all of Farnsworth's Wright era. The most popular one is The Three Marked Pennies by Mary Elizabeth Councilman, which is a great horror ghost story, which is by also a woman writer who's sadly sort of forgotten these days. But she was more popular in her lifetime than Robert E. Howard or Clark Ashton Smith or H.P. Lovecraft, who were all writing at the same time. And often also Black God's Kiss beat out the excellent Conan story, People of the Black Circle, for the best story of that issue, which is quite a few. I mean, I love both of them. They're both great stories.
As I recall, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure Black God's Kiss was probably the first C.L. Moore story I read as a teen. And I think before I encountered Shambleau even, and I'm pretty sure I read it in one of the original Flashing Swords anthologies edited by Lynn Carter. And I remember reading that, impressing me way back then.
It was definitely the first one by her I read, because I had the Ace edition that you just held up. Yeah, that was my original C.L. Moore edition. I had the Gerald of Glory Ace edition with the same cover that you just held up. Unfortunately, I gave it away. It was quite a bit right now. I gave it away when I got the Fantasy Masterworks, which has the Gerald of Glory and Northwest Smith, because the Northwest Smith stories were very hard to come by in the 1990s, 80s, 90s. So I was glad to get it and gave my original Gerald of Glory copy away to a friend from university, who I hope really, really enjoyed them.
Well, the October 1934 issue of Weird Tales, so that would have been a year, 11 months after she published Shambleau. She published,
and there were two other. I think there were at least two or three other Northwest Smith story in between.
Yeah, and
so she was quite prolific at the time.
And they paid her pretty well for the era. She got $100 for Shambleau for the first one, which is a lot of money for that era.
I think it was I think more than she got at the bank in a whole month or something like that.
Yeah, you can see why she would want to protect her ability to write these stories on the side.
I'm just speculating here, but beside the issue of payments and benefits and hours, I can't imagine that if you're working at a bank, they would probably not look nicely, because banks are supposed to be staid and respected.
Oh yes,
pillars of society, and maybe not selling lurid horror and sword and sorcery stories to
right.
Also, Weird Tales is quite lurid for the pulp era. I mean, look at the covers. Weird Tales was a lurid magazine, and the stories which we'll get into are also, well, there's obviously sex in those stories, quite frank for the era.
Yes, and
probably not something the bank would want to be associated with.
No, even today, I think banks would probably not like it if you probably. I mean, we still have these stories of teachers getting fired because they wrote a romance novel or an erotic romance or something like that. Yeah. This still happens today.
Yeah. Well, in the October 34 issue of Weird Tales, it was also subtitled "The Weirdest Story Ever Told." Black God's Kiss was, which is interesting because in a lot of ways, I kind of think Shambleau is a little bit weirder, but they're both pretty weird. So one of the things that happened out of C.L. Moore writing for Weird Tales is she got a fan letter addressed to Dear Mr. Moore from one Henry Kuttner, who was also writing science fiction in the era, very good science fiction. And they developed a friendship on, I was about to say
I think
online.
it was Lovecraft who introduced him. I think Kuttner was a pen pal of Lovecraft because everybody was a pen pal of Lovecraft, and
Right.
Lovecraft told him to write to C.L. Moore, and Kuttner did, and kind of didn't get that Lovecraft Lovecraft actually said something like write to Cassie Moore, but Kuttner didn't get that she was a woman, even though it was not unknown at the time.
Right. And so they became friends. And I was about to say online, but of course, through letters. And started a long distance relationship at the beginning, and then eventually were married and became writing partners as well. And I have a really cute picture of them writing together. As it loads here for those that are watching on YouTube. That's them together in the early days at the typewriter. And it is said that they would be able to stop mid-sentence paragraph and pick up where the other one left off. And they really did blend a really great third voice. I don't really see a lot of huge, I think C.L. Moore, she was really good at collaborating because she collaborated with other people as well, like Forrest Ackerman and other people. And she really was great at developing this third voice. And their work together is really good. It's really sad that in the 60s and 70s, if you look at some of the paperbacks of the books that they wrote together, they get republished and it'll be like Henry Kuttner, giant and huge on the cover, and then in real small letters it'll say with C.L. Moore. And
there were a lot of the collaborations were credited solely to Kuttner, even though, and I mean the stories about what's his name, Gallagher, this inventor who can only invent when he's drunk. Those were pure Kuttner because C.L. Moore was still alive at the time and told them no, I had nothing to do with those stories.
Right. And so she continued to write on her own as well. She wrote in 1944, she wrote a really landmark novella called No Woman Born, which is a utopian story that's considered one of her best science fiction stories and considered one of the earliest stories about cyborgs. It's been a long time since I read it, but it's funny. I believe that's the first C.L. Moore I ever read, me personally, because I read it collected. In fact, when I kind of rediscovered C.L. Moore through The Future is Female a couple of years ago, I had to be like, oh, wait, I have read her before, because I had read No Woman Born in a collection.
At any rate, it's a very, very good story. I read it for the Retro Hugos 2 years ago because it was a Retro Hugo finalist. It lost out to Killdozer by Theodore Sturgeon, which is also a very good story, but personally, I prefer No Woman Born. Vintage Seasons is another really good solo C.L. Moore story from the same era.
Right.
It's from 1946.
She only wrote one novel by herself, and that's Doomsday Morning. I have reviewed it on my blog. It is a very weird and very interesting novel about a post-apocalyptic theater group. It's very anachronistic, out of date, but really cool. If you like such
Judgment
things.
Night a novel, or is it a novella? Judgment, because that was also solo Moore, I think. Judgment Night.
I believe that's considered a novella, but that's that whole thing of like Of Mice and Men is considered a novel, even though it's only 100 pages. Mm-hmm. Like I go back and forth on that.
Depending, it is not really. I think of it as a novel, but I see it referred to as a novella. And in fact, when Tor reprinted I Am Legend, we added a bunch of Matheson short stories in the back just to pad it out, because it was not the length that modern consumers would expect a novel to be.
A lot of the old novels are
160-page novel for 60 cents are long gone. If you're charging $6.99 for a paperback, people want it to be thicker.
Right. And one of the cool things that Kuttner and C.L. Moore did or were a part of was in the early 40s. They were part of the Manana Society literary like sci-fi group, and they moved out to California, and they lived in Los Angeles. And in 1940, they were a part of this sci-fi group that included Robert Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and Anthony Boucher. I'm finally saying it right. I always say Boucher. I know it's Boucher.
I spent my entire life calling him Anthony Boucher. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I call him Boucher. He, I guess, never corrected people, supposedly. But he wrote, and I really recommend this book, Rocket to the Morgue, which, because he was known as a mystery writer too. And he wrote this closed door murder mystery called Rocket to the Morgue about this literary society. It's like the sci-fi club has a murder in it. And so there's fictionalized versions of the Kuttners, of Hubbard and Heinlein, and it is the only fiction book on my nonfiction sci-fi shelf. Because it's incredible, and in fact, I'm gonna reread it. Well,
I must really get that one someday, because
Yeah.
it sounds really like the sort of thing I should love and enjoy.
I highlighted the shit out of this locked door murder mystery for a reason. It's not, it's more, it's a history as much of, because you have to read between the lines, and Cora, you reading this, you'll be like, oh, that's Hubbard. Oh, that's Heinlein. That's the Kuttners. You'll see it. It's really, really cool. So they were really active and a part of that LA community. Before Kuttner's death, Catherine Moore started teaching a class at USC, which she continued teaching after her death. I have tried desperately to, like, Indiana has all this archive history about its students and its alumni. So I found a lot of stuff about C.L. Moore in relation to Indiana University for 1 year. There is nothing online about C.L. Moore teaching this class at USC. I cannot find anything. No anecdotes, no people blogging about it, nothing. So apparently
it's weird because it's quite possible that some of the students are still alive. That was in the 1950s. The students, they would be old by now, but they would have been still alive. There might still be some alive.
Now, there's a book that was published and edited by one Greg Cox called I Am Legend, that was dedicated to Henry Kuttner. And I am assuming that because of the way that book is dedicated to Kuttner, that Matheson had a relationship with the Kuttners in the 50s, because that book was written in the 50s. So I'm assuming, he only dedicated the book to Henry Kuttner. So I don't know if he had a really good relationship.
Matheson was in California too, wasn't he? Wasn't, because he was a screenwriter. So he would have been in the same area.
Yeah,
so they
was
probably
part of the
knew each
Southern
other.
California literary group. He lived in Calabasas. The whole time I knew him, he lived in Calabasas, California. I should qualify, you very nicely gave me credit for being the editor of I Am Legend. I should mention I was, the last in a long succession of people. I mean, clearly I did not edit the text.
I'm saying you put out an
I was not born when that book was published. But yes, I reprinted it at Tor, multiple editions, have plugged it aggressively and worked with Matheson and bringing it
right.
And my biggest, most successful accomplishment I will brag about is that, I'm the editor who got that book on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yes, you did.
Because I spent a year negotiating with Warner Brothers to put Will Smith on the cover. And people laugh, oh, that's, no, I have
that
a
is
whole
literally the reason it got on the New York Times
bestseller list. I can't
list.
believe he must be rolling over in his grave. And trust me, that, people have mixed feelings about the Will Smith movie. That movie, the book sold phenomenally. It remains the best-selling book.
My copy of I Am Legend is this movie copy. I have this copy on my shelf because I was so happy to finally find a copy of the book.
It's sold
in Germany, where they're not easy to find.
It sold, this is a book that was published in 1954. That book sold like hundreds and thousands of copies, and not just mercenarily, but it means hundreds and thousands of new readers discovered Richard Matheson because I was quote tacky enough to put, you know, Will Smith on the cover and do a movie tie-in edition. And honestly, it was funny. I was yelling, "Oh my God, they, you know, they ruined the book, and poor Richard Matheson." I have seen Richard Matheson's royalty statements on those books. Trust me, you know, he had no complaints. You know, wow, that's still probably the best-selling book I've ever edited. The
like I said, that's
again, I spent a year.
I like
talking
Richard
with Warner
Matheson, but
Brothers.
the books were, lots of old science fiction was not easy to find at all, and in Germany it was even more difficult. But this I found at the regular bookstore. I found it in a Thalia shop, and of course took it home. And yes, I was like, okay, it has Will Smith on the cover, but who cares? It's a text from the 1950s. Who cares if there's Will Smith? And there could be worse people than Will Smith on the cover.
I will not hijack this discussion to preach the gospel of movie tie-in editions, but no, there were books. What Dreams May Come was out of print before the Robin Williams movie came along.
My edition of the first Saw book is a movie tie-in edition to the 1997 Saw movie, which was pretty good actually, though it has nothing to do with the story. But this is a way, movie tie-in editions often are the way you get to read those old stories, and that's great. Even if the cover is a bit weird. Who cares?
The Prophecies was out of print before they made the movie. I put the movie poster on the cover, New York Times bestseller. All these. It's a way of getting the book out to people who have never heard of Richard Matheson or CL. You know, when they make the Jirel Ojari movie, you know, for God's sakes, you know.
I really hope that we get either Northwest Smith or Jirel, or both of them, preferably a miniseries on Netflix or something like that. And yes, put whoever plays the role on the cover. I don't really care.
And even honestly,
we have a couple years before Jessica Chastain is ready.
Edition. Our sales of I Am Legend, the regular tour edition with, you know, the pale-faced zombies on the cover, we suddenly had to go to multiple printings the minute the trailer for the movie hit out. We were suddenly, wow, you know, never underestimate, you know, the power of a media tie-in.
Yeah, people, a lot of people don't know that there are books.
The books, you know.
There's a lot of things.
People don't even know.
Edmund Hamilton. I discovered Edmund Hamilton via the anime adaptation of the Captain Future stories as a kid, which I loved. And then years later I learned, wow, there are books. And I was like, I must get those books. I loved that anime.
All right, well, to get back on track.
Yeah, sorry. We're sort of digressing here.
On.
But it's really interesting what Greg has to say here.
I know. We talked a lot about it in the Richard Matheson episode. So which I recommend. Now
I must listen to that one.
It's your fault you mentioned I Am Legend. Okay.
Yes. Now, yes, but I do think that Kuttner and Matheson were friends, obviously dedicated to him, but I think he was part of that whole writing community. I wish, if there's anybody out there who took any of C.L. Moore's classes, I'd love to talk to you about it. So you know, that's something that I would like to know more about. And I don't know, I haven't looked into where her papers are stored, if she stored them at USC or not. That's a thing that I'm probably going to be looking into soon. I'm currently doing DC Fontana research, so I got to do that for a little while before I can get into that. Which, by the way, Greg, you and I need to talk about at some point. Anywho, back to C.L. Moore. So when Kuttner died in 1958, she pretty much retired from writing. After she did 4 years of screenwriting. She wrote for Maverick and The Alaskans and 77 Sunset Strip, the detective series, but that's pretty much it.
I have actually seen 77 Sunset Strip because it was really popular in Germany because it had a really good dub, but I've never knowingly seen one of her episodes. And I suppose the name would have, I think she used Catherine Kuttner, but the name probably would have rang a bell at the time when I watched them.
Yeah, she was writing as Catherine Kuttner, screenwriting. So, yeah, I don't know if I can sit through an episode of Maverick, but maybe if I can find the one that she wrote, I'll give it a spin. It's interesting because when you look into these things, like I just randomly found like a radio serial that Philip K. Dick wrote in the 50s, and I didn't even know that it existed until like last week. And it's just funny when you find some of these things and like someone has put them on YouTube. It's like just the weirdest thing.
We recently started watching Alfred Hitchcock Presents late night on MeTV. And it's so funny, you get to the end sometimes and, oh, written by Harlan Ellison. Oh, written by Robert Bloch, written by, based on a story by...
Lots of these. I mean, Richard Matheson, I probably discovered him first as a screenwriter before I actually read anything by him.
And by the way, one of the things I'm getting at the UCLA archive tomorrow, I'm literally going tomorrow, is there are lots of treatments by science fiction writers that never got produced, including Philip Jose Farmer and Robert Sheckley and A.E. von Vogt. And they're all sitting there at UCLA, and I will have them tomorrow in my greedy paws. So that it's cool that the science fiction writers were out there working. That's one of the things is in that era, like your Mathesons, your George Clayton Johnsons, like they were getting work and selling treatments, even if they weren't being made, but some of them were writing for the Twilight Zone. They were getting work doing this. So that whole community, I think, talked a lot. All right. As far as the history goes, she won some Lifetime Achievement Awards in the 80s. She kind of came out of retirement for a little bit before her death in 1987. Not to write, but she came to a few conventions and received these awards. There was rumors that she was working on a fantasy novel, but that didn't really come to fruition. And with that,
she also had dementia towards the end. She suffered from dementia, which is also why she didn't get she would have been the first woman grandmaster of Sifra, but her second husband declined the honor because he was already suffering from dementia. The second husband, who gets a lot of bad rap, which I'm not sure he deserves.
Yeah,
and I think we'll talk about him later if we do.
Yeah, he just didn't want her. He thought she would be confused and it would be embarrassing.
Yeah, I don't actually think she was unhappy with the second husband. Yes, she stopped writing, but maybe she just didn't want to write anymore because it reminded her of Kuttner, or maybe because almost 30 years more than 20 years of writing had been enough for her. People retire all the time. So I think the second husband probably gets a bad rap for a lot of not so good reasons.
Do you really think that C.L. Moore would have stopped writing because a second husband told her to?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
No way.
She probably she was done. She was done, and then she retired and lived the rest of her life. Still continued teaching, and she apparently was happy with his second husband.
Yeah, it seems so. All right, so let's look at the cover of the Weird Tales. This was the cover of November 1933 Weird Tales that Shambleau was in. For those of you on YouTube, I'm sorry for the audio listeners. This is one that might be a good one to watch on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a very typical Margaret Brundle cover of the era, and oddly enough, doesn't seem to fit. Doesn't seem to be for any specific story. It's not for Shambleau at any rate.
Shambleau was the opening story of the issue, and I thumbed through the issue on the Internet Archives, and this is what the first page looked like. For Shambleau. Have you seen this before, Greg?
I haven't seen that art before.
Yeah. Let's scroll in a little bit.
Again, Weird Tales giving away the big twist on the opening page. Not the first time this happened to C.L. Moore or anybody. I mean, they give away the twist of Black God's Kiss 2 on the opening page.
Yeah, because this does give away the twist. So my question was, did she want to write this introduction at the beginning, or do you think Weird Tales kind of pushed this on her? This man has conquered space before, or the mention of Medusa in the introduction? We're getting into spoilers now. So if you haven't read the story, pause, go read the story. Yes, the picture kind of gives away the ending a little bit too. What are your thoughts on this, Cora? As you've researched and read a lot of the Weird Tales of this era, do you think that this was kind of pushed on her, mentioning the Gorgon or the Medusa thing in the beginning?
Might have, but I mean, especially with C.L. Moore and both Moore and Kuttner, there's a lot of literary and mythological mythological allusions in their story. Even especially in this 40 stories, there's a lot of stuff I actually have to look up because it's no longer as well remembered as it used to be. But Medusa is, of course, it's a very famous myth, but Weird Tales was more literary than most of the pulp magazines. So I actually like this Man Has Conquered Space Before intro. It's also very Weird Tales of cycles of civilization which collapse and then return. So the Medusa thing is actually so kind of obvious that I'm not sure if really Weird Tales readers in the 1930s needed to be told what a Medusa is. I think they probably would have known.
Right. And personally, I am a fan of that introduction. I do like the Weird Tales feel to it. And like we talked about earlier, that the story just really captures the Weird Tales vibe right from the beginning, like has that cosmic feel. And the cycle thing too, also. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but whenever I think of these the Northwest Smith stories or the Lee Brackett stories, I don't really think of them as futuristic sci-fi. I think of them as being like kind of this ancient, out of time, like when the solar
there's
system...
a reason we call these stories Sword and Planet these days. So there's not a lot of swords in C.L. Moore. Lee Brackett is more Sword and Planet. C.L. Moore is more weird fiction in space. I think, which is also why a lot of people have problems with her, because she's not what you expect. You expect when you hear like, oh, she had this medieval sword woman, she had this early space rogue, Han Solo, Malcolm Reynolds type character. You expect a lot of action, and that's not what you get with C.L. Moore. You get dreamlike atmosphere, you get psychedelic experiences. Which is, I think, which always surprises people because you don't expect it. If you've read Weird Tales, of course, you expect a bit more of it. But if you come into them, I remember the first time I read Northwest Smith, I was like, okay, but didn't they say this would be like a kind of Han Solo type character? This is not really that sort of story, but it's great.
Greg?
Exactly. On paper, I think, the setups always sort of lend themselves to sort of swashbuckling adventure, but that's neither Shambleau or, in fact, even the Gyrell stories are that. And
they're not. They're wonderful, but you have to accept them for what they are.
They're all very obsessive fever dream stories. For all that Gyrell has his reputation as being the proto-Red Sonja barbarian swordswoman, which she is, there's actually very little swashbuckling. It's mostly her, being tossed into these weird nightmarish dreamscapes and being attacked on an emotional level. And Shambleau is, he's a roguish space adventurer, but no, the story is this weird, obsessive, emotional fever dream story with very little in the way of, blasters and, heroics.
Well, there are heat guns and ray guns, but
takes sort of pulp situations. But
Smith never uses his. Well, yes, he fires at the floor once to drive off the mob. But the only guy who actually shoots someone with his gun is his pal Yarrow. So they
lean more towards, honestly, horror stories. They're more, Shambleau is more akin, sort of oddly enough, Edgar Allan Poe than Buck Rogers. Even though
it's a horror. It's a science fiction horror.
Buck Rogers setting. They're all sort of, again, Lovecraft, Poe. The vibe you get is very rich and sort of obsessive and nightmarish. And I actually had the experience. I will make a comment that I read all the Gyrell stories recently again, just gave me through the pandemic. I will make the diagnosis that they're good, that I would not read them all back to back because they're all kind of have the same.
I think with the early C.L. Moore,
very all over the place. They all have her kind of thrust into some weird phantasmagoric thing and running into weird metaphorical representations of depression and angst. And, they're all very good and very deep and immersive and great, but they all, read in one sitting, they all start to read the same. Oh, this is Black God's Kiss again.
Yeah. The early C.L. Moore stories should be spaced out. If you also the Northwest Smith ones, don't read. And this goes actually for a lot of Weird Tales authors. Don't read too many of them one after another. Exactly. Whether it's Lovecraft or Clark S. Smith or C.L. Moore. The only one I can actually read several ones in a row is Robert E. Howard, but then probably it's also better to switch around, have a Conan, and then maybe something, and then maybe Solomon Kane, and then maybe something completely different like Sailor Steve Costigan. But
yeah, I would agree that when I read this, like when I started it, I was like, oh God, this is incredible. This is great. And then after a while, I was like, they do kind of have to be broken up a little bit. And I think that's really good advice, Greg.
also, they were broken up. I mean,
they were broken. They weren't intended to be written.
You were not meant to read those one after another.
Yeah.
You had to wait for for a couple of months until the next one came out.
Right. That's how they were intended to be.
And you were also supposed to mix them in with Robert E. Howard or Lovecraft or, of course, the Sibyl Quinn story, if you can get through that one.
One flavor among many, not to sit down and just eat a big bowl of salsa.
Well, and I will say that later in life, one of the other LA writers that C.L. Moore became very good friends with was Lee Brackett, and they had a friendship. And you know, her Eric Stark character is very similar to Northwest Smith, and a lot of the settings in this kind of like
and ancient... of course Black Amazon of Mars, the Eric John Stark story, is pretty much a rewrite of Black God's Kiss, only with a happier ending and written from the guy's perspective, from the man's perspective.
Right. And you know, they had a really great relationship, but and a lot of these stories they kind of have like a similar vibe and feeling of I know C.L. Moore wrote this as the future when she was writing it in 1933. I think it is kind of better now to look at these stories as like kind of out of place in like another era of the solar system when you know perhaps like these planets had different epochs, and like, you know, that's kind of
view them much like I view a lot of these pulp science fiction stories set on Mars and Venus, and it's always the same. The solar system is quite similar in the stories, but I view it as a parallel reality, and I have less problems reading those because it's all nonsense. I know that the solar system doesn't work. Mars doesn't look like that. Venus doesn't look like that. Mercury is not tidally locked, doesn't have a twilight belt, and there are no prisons on the moon. I know what it's but I can read it as a sort of alternate reality. But when I try to read some of the bad stories in Astounding, and there were some really bad ones in Astounding, which are supposedly hard science fiction, those are usually just, oh, please, they're more dated than those stories which were pretty much pure fantasy even back then.
Okay, these were weird tales. I don't think anybody came to Weird Tales expecting, rigorously scientific hard SF.
No, they did publish a lot of SF. I mean,
science, accurate astronomy fiction. It's called weird, creepy Medusa vampire women on Mars. Okay,
All right, let's drill down a little bit on Northwest Smith, whose name is known and respected in every dive and wild outpost on a dozen wild planets. Was a cautious man despite his reputation. He set his back against the wall and gripped his pistol and heard the rising shout coming nearer and nearer. Okay, so that's kind of how he gets introduced as a character. Yes, he gets described all the time as a space rogue, as the proto Han Solo, and he's almost more proto Indiana Jones, really. Than
Indiana Jones, of course, also came from these stories. I mean, there are more Indiana Jones prototypes in Lee Brackett stories. As Lee Brackett has a lot of space archaeologists who are basically Indiana Jones in space, but they came from the same mold.
We know Lucas read Lee Brackett and he hired her.
Yeah, of course, he read her. And he I'm pretty sure probably read Moore too, because the stories were in print in his lifetime.
Yeah. Greg, what do you think about Northwest Smith as a character?
I'll make a confession here. I fear that Shambleau may be actually the only story I've read.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm a vampire guy, so I come to Shambleau via vampire fiction. I've seen it in vampire collections. I put it in one of my vampire anthologies. So I come to it not as a pulp adventure blasters thing, or as a Northwest Smith story. I come to it as one of the classic early science fiction vampire stories, which is the context I have experienced in him. It's the context to which.
Well, he's kind of.
I've actually read any of the other Northwest Smith stories. I know Shambleau because
You
It's one of
collected
the
it,
early
yeah, which is one of the
proto
reasons why
alien
I
vampire stories, but
yeah. Well, first off, he we should say to not just you, but to everyone who, because I put out to read this story before this episode, but this collection is all the Northwest Smith stories, and there is a crossover story with Jarell of Jory, which is a very weird one. There's a couple that she wrote here with Kuttner, and there's one she wrote with Forrest J. Ackerman, which is really weird. But he basically is a monster hunter, archaeologist type character. He gets all these jobs that always end up, involving kind of a monster of the week type of thing in the story.
And there's usually, the monster is often a beautiful woman, or the stories usually involve a beautiful woman.
Yeah, and some kind of cosmic angle where, yeah. So,
it's as if Cthulhu was an attractive woman. That's what a lot of these stories are like.
Yeah, and but back to Shambleau. One of my, kind of one of the sentences or paragraphs that really sold me on the story right away is on the second page, which was, it was a motley crowd, Earthmen and Martians, and a sprinkling of Venetian swamp women, strange and nameless denizens of unnamed planets, a typical Lacadoral mob. I'm not sure if I'm saying Lacadoral correctly, the name of the city on Mars. I love the just pulpy, just like ridiculousness of like the Venetian swamp women and all that. And so when I read this, because I read this collection recently. I read Shambleau before collected. It's been collected many, many, many times.
More than I think way more than 30 times, and that was I think a while ago, because I tried counting it, but there was some. But it was at least more than 30. There were more than 30 reprints.
And some of you will come to this from listening to the audio version read by C.L. Moore, which I am going to be sharing widely before this episode comes out. And that version, she edits quite a bit. She cuts parts. She changes wordings a little bit, like quipped is changed to said and things like that. And there's a whole paragraph she cut, and I highlighted it because I followed along listening to it. And it was, he had no intention of using that heat beam. He knew by now that they would kill him unless he started the gunplay himself. He did not mean to give up his life for any girl alive, but a severe mauling he expected. He braced himself instinctively as the mob weaved in within itself. She cut that whole paragraph, right, when reading it for the audio version. Or I'm assuming she did, or I don't know if she did for later editions, but this edition, which is fair.
My edition also definitely has that paragraph.
Yeah, this would be this is 2019, this edition, the Golden Works.
Like I said, I have the Fantasy Masterworks edition from the UK, and that's, let me check when it was actually printed. It's fairly, where is it?
Yeah, so I found it interesting that because that version was recorded in
2002, so it's 20 years old now. Wow, that is.
Yeah, so that version where she read it was a part of a series of classic tales that were recorded for a series of records in the 60s. And so, I mean, she did that recording in the 60s, right? So
was there possibly a time limit? Because I do know that there was an era in the history of audiobooks where you actually read. These days you can read unabridged books because the technology just...
Yeah, I have no way of knowing.
Made a living.
Yeah, you have to. There was a limit. If it was on tape or on a record, then there was a limit, because records and tapes have time limits
or something. It had to,
So she probably cut for that reason, but the changing of like the little things like the quips and things like that, I think she did that. I think she was doing that in the moment, but I don't know.
I think it might have been simply that it was a pronunciation issue or something, or reading issues, because when you read something aloud, sometimes you find, okay, this is kind of of clumsy, let's change this. And if you don't read it aloud, it would go through.
And
Yeah,
let's say any author going back and looking at a story they
it's
wrote,
gonna feel that way. Yeah.
it's going to end up wanting to tinker with it a little bit.
Yes.
I recently donated an old story I wrote in the 80s to a Kickstarter thing. And I actually had to retype the story because, yes, the story was written on a typewriter back in the day. Yes, I'm that old. And, you know, I had to fine, I'll retype the story and you have a digital file. And yeah, I didn't go nuts. It wasn't like my old 15-year-old fan fiction where I really had to do some rewriting. But yeah, occasionally, oh, well, that was a bit wordy. Okay, I don't need that adverb
Yeah,
anymore.
you do that. It's
You know,
normal.
And as pulpy as this,
I didn't go nuts because I was just quickly retyping the story so we could give it as a free bonus for a Kickstarter. But yeah, I might, I don't need, might get rid of some said book isms or something that seemed really cool to me, you know, when I was a young writer in 1982, you know. I think anyone who's going to like, oh, I can clean up that sentence. That's kind of a clumsy sentence, you know. Oh boy, I really loved adverbs last night. How many adjectives could I cram into one sentence? Maybe I'll just tone down the prose a little bit, you know.
well, even for this being one of her earliest stories, and I know you already said this, Cora, the writing is really good.
Yeah, amazing that this is her first, you know,
professional sale.
That she just kind of bam, you know, kind of.
And I'm going to read here this part. Shambleau, vaguely of French origin, it must be, and strange enough to hear it from the lips of Venetian and Martian drylanders, but it was their use that puzzled him more. We never let those things live, the ex-patrolman said. So there's this whole scene where, you know, he sees how afraid everyone is of her, but he takes her in. And one of the things that's really cool about this story is how alien and strange she is, and the great descriptions of how inhuman Shambleau is. But at the same time, it's a wee bit horny too, which is really weird. And I think is one of the things that's kind of interesting dynamic that's at play in the story. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but like, that's the lurid nature. That's a better word, lurid, than horny. But lurid and alien at the same time, it's a really interesting dynamic that she's able to pull off.
It's for the era, it's a very erotic story for the era. I mean, we're talking about the early 30s where it's not, but even the spicy pulps were not really that erotic. They have this reputation and the lurid covers, but the contents were not nearly as erotic as you assume. And this is really, I mean, it culminates in what is basically a 2-page drug-fueled tentacle sex scene, which is, that would be difficult to get past an editor even today.
Basically, for all that, you know, oh, he's supposed to be this Indiana Jones character. No, this is a story about a guy who gets addicted to tentacle porn, basically. You know,
he falls of course,
the horror story. You know,
it's a horror story, and of course, you immediately get. I immediately felt sympathy for this, for the Shambleau, the girl who's afraid and who's chased down by a mob, because you think of witch hunts, of lynch mobs and that sort of thing, and you have immediately have sympathy for her, and of course you have sympathy for Smith for protecting her, except that, yes, in this case the mob was, let's say it, not wrong.
Right.
Also, one thing we should probably mention is that Shambleau she's described as brown-skinned throughout, so she's an alien, but she's described as brown-skinned, and it's not in this story, but in other stories. Northwest Smith is also described as brown-skinned, so he's probably a person of color. I think there's one story where he lovingly describes his body and every single scar on it, and he has a lot of them.
And
so
I remember that one. Yeah,
it's quite interesting because we have this assumption that all that early science fiction and fantasy was lily white, and it usually wasn't.
Yeah, Lee Brackett definitely.
Lee Brackett, of course, had people of color in her books.
Yeah. One little world building detail that I really liked on page 8 of this version of Shambleau. She describes the Lacadarl raw camp town that it was in those days. I love that she said in those days, because I think that little detail gives it this like, oh, I'm telling you this story from back in, this grand old time.
It has this old timey, a long time ago in a galaxy, or in this case on a Mars far away.
Yeah,
but
as you can see,
I also have the idea of this is a frontier town, like many
Yeah.
in the US, and nowadays then it's probably grown up and become a big city nowadays in the later times.
Yeah, and it gives the sense that we're hearing this almost mythic tale of what Northwest.
A rougher, less civilized era,
Yeah, exactly. Now I did a lot of highlighting of things early on in the story, but I skipped a bit. And when we get to the part that the tentacle parts, I just think the writing here is just incredible. And this conflict and knowledge, this mingling of rapture and revulsion, all took place in the flashing of a moment while the scarlet worms coiled and crawled upon him, sending deep, obscene tremors of that infinite pleasure into every atom that made up Smith. And he could not stir in the slimy, ecstatic embrace, and a weakness was flooding that grew deeper after each succeeding wave of intense delight, and the traitor in his soul strengthened and drowned out the revulsion. Something within him ceased to struggle as he sank wholly into a blazing darkness that was oblivion to all else, that devouring rapture.
Yeah.
Wow.
One of the best described orgasms in science fiction, and probably in all of literature.
Yeah. What was that, Greg?
Somehow the bank didn't want to be associated with these slimy, sticky.
Yeah, obviously not.
Right.
I suppose if you work for bank, even today, they wouldn't be too thrilled if you wrote orgasmic tentacle sex scenes.
Right. And that I had the experience of, because when I was reading this, like I said, I picked up this copy when I was on my trip to Portland in June at Powell's, and I started reading this recently, but it was very clear in my mind that this was 1933 that she's writing this. This is 6-8 years before World War II started, and you're writing this kind of intense stuff. Like, it's easy to forget that people were writing stuff like this, that this stuff existed in that era, because we had this idea that
we assume we wouldn't have get that sort of thing until the 1960s. You would, if you just gave this paragraph to someone who doesn't know the story, they would probably, but who knows a bit about science fiction history, they would think it's probably a new wave story from the 1960s. Only that it's 30 years older.
Maybe, or somebody, yes.
Yeah. Well, and especially if you're reading like some of the cleaner stuff that existed in like Astounding and Amazing, and like
by the time the Kuttner, C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner wrote for Astounding, the sex scenes are largely gone. There is no, because there are hints of sex and mentions of sex in all of her weird tales, in most of her weird tale stories, also in the Jirel stories. Jirel is pretty much, I'm not a wilting virgin, and but yeah, if you force a kiss on me, I'm going to avenge myself and kill you, which he does. But I was surprised reading the Astounding stories, or some of them that Kuttner Moore did. They were very, very good, but the sexual element of the weird tale stories is completely missing, probably because they wouldn't have gotten that past John W. Campbell and his assistant Kay Tarrant. Yeah,
and Campbell definitely was more worried about what his parent company was going to do to him on that stuff. So, and that was definitely like a thing he was dealing with. As far as getting to now, now, Greg, you collected this in a collection of vampire stories. Now, a lot of people might not necessarily think of this automatically as a vampire story, but it very clearly is, because as it says towards the end of the story, that Shambleau is taking your life force and is sucking it out of you. And so it's an early version of that kind of space vampire thing that Colin Wilson would eventually do and would eventually become Life Force. So, you know,
Greg also wrote a space vampire story. Greg probably, what's it called? The Veil of Estrella. Greg probably collected that one. I don't know if you did.
But which story are you talking about?
The Veil of, I think, Estrella. It's from 1944. It was a Lee Brackett space vampire story.
Yes, that one flew under my radar.
Oh, it did. Wow. But it's a really good one. It's a really, really good one.
Yeah. Well,
it's fairly little known for some reason.
Yeah, like I said, I actually wrote a book on the history of vampire literature, and yeah, I confess that one flew under my radar. You know, so.
Oh well, we
also
both
not.
Have an assignment
it's not
now,
been collected a lot.
Either.
It's one of the rarer ones. I think when I read it, I had to resort to an actual scan of the actual pulp magazine.
Well,
I think it was from 1944.
From Weird Tales, I relied very heavily on reprint anthologies and such.
I think it hasn't been reprinted. I know it was not easy to find. I couldn't find a reprint
anthologies
edition.
I could find reprinting all the old stories and such. You know?
Well, one thing that's especially happened in the last couple of years is now anytime you're talking about these era of pulp magazines, is that Internet Archive has them all now. So you know, like, yes, I read Who Goes There for this series in a book, but I was able to go back and look at the original Astounding that it was in.
Really important. It's really good to do that, I think, if you can. And you can. Everybody can. It's even if you don't want to read them, but it's interesting to see the environment, to see the ads, to see the interior art. And if you check back a few issues later, then you get the letters and the reactions.
Yes, which is really cool too. And that's, you know, like the first evidence that we have of Walter Tevis doing anything is like a letter he wrote to Startling Stories, you know, when he was like 12 years old. And it's like, here's the author of Queen's Gambit writing to Startling Stories when he's 12. It's fucking cool.
You have a lot of these. You suddenly find a lot of famous names, even before they were famous. A 14-year-old Virginia kid wrote a letter to their Tales telling them how much he loved Black God's Kiss.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, you know, we found when we did our tour of all of Philip K. Dick's houses in Berkeley, we found a house that he lived in from 1942 to 44 only because Jesse from SFF Audio found a letter and an Amazing Stories from 1943 from Philip K. Dick that had a return address. And of all the Dick scholars, no one had known where he lived during those 2 years and hadn't found that house. And we went to that house just because of that letter, right? That Jesse found and tweeted at me.
It's amazing that the houses still standing many times. I remember looking
all the
up,
houses he lived in are still standing.
Yeah, I remember finding an address on an old letter of Heinlein's and saying, okay, now I'm going to look that up on Google Street View. It was somewhere in the Hollywood Hills, and the house still stands.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing was the neighbor was coming out to take out his garbage when we were there. And he was like, he was a Dick fan. And so when we told him that, you know, hey, Philip K. Dick lived at your neighbor's house, and he was like, no way. And then, but the woman had lived there since the 60s and she had no idea. Right. And so we were able to tell her. And, you know, one of the interesting, all the houses were there except for the apartment where he wrote Earthshaker. That building has been knocked down and replaced with a house. But even the house he lived in when he was 8 is still there. And because he and his mom moved all over Berkeley, we got to experience, like, you know, whereas Ursula Le Guin's very rich, very expensive house that she lived in her whole childhood, it's a very big class difference when you when you look at their experience. Anyways, I'm sorry, I could go off on a tangent on that, but back to Shambleau. You know, one of the things about this story is, yes, we talked about how the ending is kind of giving away this thing towards the end with the I suppose you recognize the legend of Medusa. There isn't any question that the ancient Greeks knew of them. Does it mean that there have been civilizations before yours that set out from Earth and explored other planets? Or did one of the Shambleau somehow make its way to Greece 3,000 years ago? And that's kind of a neat twist with this idea that, she's the Medusa, she's the Gorgon.
She somehow inspired the myth. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's before we get to the mental food thing and to the space vampire thing. That's kind of like in the next page, which is the Shambleau uses a mental reach to get mental food. I don't quite know how to put it. Just as a beast eats the bodies of other animals, acquires within each meal greater power over the bodies of the rest, so the Shambleau, stroking itself up from the life forces of men, increases its power over the minds and souls of other men. So
it's like, on the vampire stake, okay, so you've got this vampire who, has enthralls people and drains their life force and control, that's a pretty basic vamp. You could draw a line between like Carmilla and, Shambleau there, sort of Carmilla, which is one of the primordial vampire texts pre-Dracula, you're probably familiar with, but yeah, it starts out, is introduced as this vulnerable, waifish young woman who's apparently in danger, but then exerts this mysterious influence. And gee, suddenly poor Laura is slowly draining away as this strange, clingy, sort of, apparently vulnerable, character.
It's quite possible that C.L. Moore read Carmilla, because it's a famous story that's been reprinted a lot, and we know that she liked reading science fiction, fantasy, horror. So it's quite, we don't know, but it's quite possible that she did read it at some point.
I probably own in my possession, just in various different vampire anthologies.
Also, Carmilla has been, there is a film adaptation from the silent era, I think. There are probably more than one, but there is one from the silent era, so she may well have she may have either seen the movie or very likely read the story.
Well, and we kind of glossed over this, but just 1933, and she's got ray guns and heat guns. It's kind of cool too. It's kind of neat thing that's kind of going on, and she's imagining this spacefaring future. When we're talking 30 years before Apollo, it's an interesting thing. I love anachronistic, out of date science fiction. And so personally, like John Shirley and I used to get in arguments because he wanted to update his 70s novels, and I kept telling him, no, don't update them.
No,
the way they are.
I don't like that either. I know some people do, but I really don't like these updates. I think
he came
down. I know it's an old book.
I think he came down on the end of not doing it, but for a while, he and I would talk about that all the time, because it really bothered him that the Soviet Union was in Transmaniacon, for example, like his novel from 1978. And I'd be like, no, that's what happened. That's what was going on when you wrote it. That should be there. And I do believe he came to that conclusion eventually too. But one of the neat things that's going on here in this story is this there's the science fiction aspect, there's the horror aspect, that's going on. I guess I should have asked this earlier, Greg, but so you collected this in Tomorrow Sucks, right? Which is your space vampire or sci-fi vampire?
The thing was, I should mention that this was a collaboration with me and Toni Weisskopf at Baen, and basically who built herself as TKF Weisskopf here. And Toni basically came to me and said, let's do an anthology of science fiction vampire stories. So we went through, and this was largely, robot vampires, alien vampires, vampires going into space, vampires versus aliens. Besides the C.L. Moore story, we have the Stainless Steel Leech by Roger Zelazny, which was about a robot vampire. We have Pillar of Fire by Ray Bradbury, which is one of the more obscure stories from the Martian Chronicles about horror creatures hiding out on Mars after they've been banished from a sterile Earth, and alternate histories where the vampires have taken over the world. But the minute Tony said we need to do a vampire anthology of science fiction vampire stories. It's like, well, okay, you know, we have to have Shambleau because it's like one of the primordial, you know, science fiction. Like I said, it's literally set in an old pulp science fiction setting with a weird vampiric creature. You know?
Where did you first read Shambleau? I just because
I don't know. I honestly don't, because like I said, possibly, like I said, I wrote a book many years previous called The Transylvanian Library, which at the time was a survey of the history of vampire fiction. So surely it probably popped up in, as mentioned, it's been widely anthologized. So I may have even stumbled onto it while researching the vampire book and looking for old pulp era vampire stories. I don't, unlike Black God's Kiss, which I remember reading as a teen in Flashing Swords, I don't remember encountering Shambleau as a kid. I think I may have encountered it in the 80s when I was researching vampire fiction.
Yeah, it's funny. I shout out to Greg from Artifact Books, which is a great used bookstore in Encinitas, California. I was there, and he had a paperback that was C.L. Moore Shambleau. It was like a collection of Northwest Smith stories that was marketed as Shambleau on the cover, and it was very delicate. And Greg accurately priced it very expensively, as he should, and I didn't get it. And then like a month later was when I picked this one up. And but I mean, he still has that if people want that wonderful paperback, because it was great looking paperback. But I saw that right before, a couple of weeks before I bought this copy, and I remember I was looking at it, and I had not read Shambleau yet, admittedly, but you know, my experience with C.L. Moore before reading this collection of the Northwest Smith stories this summer was Jor-El of Jor-Reed. I'd read all of those, and I had read Black God's Kiss collected somewhere when I was younger, and kind of got reacquainted with her through reading it and reading that same story in The Future is Female, and then freaking out when I realized in Future is Female it said that she was from Indiana, and then went down the rabbit hole with that. But
by the way, she did know Clyde Bell of Bonnie and Clyde fame because she wrote it in she exchanged letters with Robert E. Howard, and Robert E. Howard had a fascination for gangsters, and C.L. Moore told him, "Oh yeah, Clyde Bell, I knew him. Because they must have been the same age about, and so apparently she knew Clyde Bell of Bonnie and Clyde fame, which is definitely an interesting bit of trivia."
That is interesting.
That's one I did not know. No, that's fascinating.
That's another thing. Bobby Deary dug up.
That helps the place you realize that she was, in fact, a contemporary of Bonnie and Clyde. Okay.
No, Cora, you've read a bunch of these letters, right? Between them, you have collections of them, or you've read
I don't have a collection of the letters C.L. Moore wrote to. I've only written some excerpts. I have the complete Lovecraft Howard correspondence. I have a collection of that, but I don't have the letter C.L. Moore wrote to Lovecraft, because she wrote to Lovecraft, to Howard. She wrote to Robert E. Howard's father. She wrote a very, very touching sympathy letter after Howard shot himself.
Oh, that's
but Bobby Deary is probably your guy, because he has all of the letters. And if I need a letter quote, then Bobby's usually the person I hit up, like, okay, where is this?
Yeah. Yeah, I got to get Bobby on the podcast sometime.
Yeah, Bobby doesn't do podcasts, unfortunately.
Yeah.
For some reason, he doesn't like podcasts. But
yeah,
if you ever need a quote from any letter from anybody out via Tales, Bobby probably knows it.
Well, and people forget too how much letter writing was a different thing. I recently went through a thing where in the Ubik outline, which I wrote about for my PKD book, there's many references to Carol Carr, Terry Carr's wife, and her personality inside, because he was basing one of the characters off Carol Carr. And at the time I said to one of the other Dick scholars, I was like, well, how did he know Carol Carr? She lived in New York. And then Gil responded by showing me a screenshot of the collected letters. And PKD and Carol Carr wrote each other 12 letters in 1964, back and forth. you know, like that's not a normal thing for us to think about these days, you know, that somebody would,
we forget how common letters were at the time, and also that this was the only way often to keep in touch with people.
so
I mean,
think
I
about
still
that
remember lengthy
Yeah.
letters from far off relatives and so on arriving when I was a young child.
Yeah. Well, and you know, these letters and it's, you know, for the people who collected them, that's great. And so did you said that Lovecraft referred to her as Kathy Moore in letters?
I think
Like,
he knew at any rate that she was a woman, and I think it was Robert Barlow who was the Weird Tales, who was a teenage Weird Tales superfan who wrote to everybody, that he wrote to C.L. Moore, and that's how she sort of got into contact with Lovecraft, and via him with Howard and Kuttner and many others. And Robert E. Howard was actually, he loved the Gerald of Jory stories and the Jirel stories, and he sent her the manuscript for for Sword Woman, the Dark Agnes story, which was his own female sword fighter character who was never published in his lifetime. The stories were only published sometime in the 70s. But he sent her the manuscript, and she said, "Oh yeah, great work, keep going." But sadly, the stories never sold.
wow.
But recently she had her own Marvel comic, believe it or not.
Yeah, later she, of course, they all got nowadays. Then came about everything Howard ever wrote, and also a lot of this because Howard wrote a lot of strong women characters. I think this is probably also why he liked the Jirel stories, because he suddenly saw, oh, there's a market for this sort of thing.
Yeah, but yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that Robert E. Howard struggled to sell anything while he was alive.
But sometimes it's a weird
It
thing.
happens to everybody.
If you look at the stories he didn't sell, but also because of course the Jirel, we're talking about Jirel now. No, the unmasking scene in the beginning when you think it's a male knight, and then the helmet comes off and it's a beautiful woman, which is a scene which is incredible, which has been imitated dozens of times, often by people who don't know where it comes from.
Right.
Because whenever there's a motorcycle helmet or a spacesuit and it comes off and oh, it's a woman and you didn't expect it, that's Jirel. That's pretty much the opening scene of Black God's Kiss, and it's which has been redone. But Robert E. Howard actually had at least two stories which are earlier where something similar happens. Oh, some characters thought to be a man. One of them was actually published. It's a Crusader story, and it's just a throwaway scene where this also where a knight suddenly turns out to be a woman in disguise. And the other is a story which was never actually the story I just discussed on SFF Audio, which was never published in his lifetime. So apparently he had an interest in female warrior heroines, but had problems selling them, or thought like, oh, but I need to have these simpering girls that occasionally cling to Conan's leg. But and I think the Jirel story probably encouraged him, like, okay, I can do this if I want to.
Yeah. All right. So we've been going for a while. Any last thoughts on C.L. Moore and Shambleau before we'll get into how people can track down your work? Starting with Greg, you know, this story is so ahead of its time and such a wonderful thing. Like, I mean, I know from the minute I started talking about C.L. Moore, you brought up how much you love this story. You know, how do you reflect on this story in the end now?
I admit I'm kicking myself for not actually rereading it last night. In anticipation, I've read it many times, but no, like I said, I remain astounded this was her first published story. And again, the more I think about it, I kind of like the contrast between, like I said, the sort of pulp Buck Rogers, ray gun, heat gun setting versus this really almost sort of gothic, obsessive horror story. Like I said, it's a weird, nice. I actually love it when genres cross over. Some people hate it. You know, put the chocolate with the peanut butter. Here you've got, like, you know, this great sort of pulp science fiction setting, you know, on this frontier Mars, and this whole sort of very almost classic vampire story with touches of Greek mythology mixed in. It just works perfectly, all those elements coming together to make the story unique, you know.
Yeah, it's real powerful stuff.
Plus, just C.L. Moore in general, if you read all of her stories, they're very immersive, obsessive, very, emotionally driven as opposed to plot driven or, you know, action driven, you know. She's like I said, this insight came to me while we were talking. There's almost something akin to put more of Poe and Lovecraft into her than, you know, Indiana Jones, you know.
Yeah, and I would say I do want to put it out there to people that I wasn't super in love with Doomsday Morning, her novel from the 50s. Like I didn't, but it is a really weird piece of work in a cool way.
I'm intrigued by your description of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it has, I think there's a lot of theater references I didn't get, but I think people who maybe like were a part of theater back in the day, maybe
Moore and Kuttner have a lot of references to literature, theater, and so on in their collaborative stories, which I had to look up simply because in a lot of times those poems, plays, novels simply aren't remembered anymore.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of stuff that went over my head, you know, that if you were like a theater kid in the 40s or 50s or whatever, like, because I think she was really, because the idea of the story is that they were it's kind of like a little bit like Postman David Brin in the sense of, now I read this a couple years ago, so I could be getting this wrong, but my memory is that they were kind of helping to rebuild society by like taking their theater troupe on the road post-apocalyptic.
Station 11, that's pretty much the plot of Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel.
That's true. Which,
yeah, that's the plot. I don't know if you ever read the story because it's not that well known, but it's a similar plot.
And I'll direct you on you. We have Conscience of the King on the original Star Trek. I always just, beyond the main plot about the, you know, war criminal and everything, I just love the idea of a roaming Shakespearean, you know, acting troupe bopping around from planet to planet, performing Shakespeare for these remote.
The Big Time is another great one. This is Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber's The Big Time, which is a sort of which is a time traveling theater group.
Yeah, and I gotta say too, I think what's really the thing about that Doomsday Morning novel by C.L. Moore is that it is wickedly out of date because of having been written in the 50s and supposed to be end of the world thing, but it really, really is weird and cool book. I appreciated it for what it was, and it's similar because we keep comparing their work because she and Lee Brackett were so similar, but in a lot of ways it's a good pairing with The Long Tomorrow by Lee Brackett, which is a very different book, but also very, very good post-apocalyptic novel. Cora, final thoughts on Shambleau as a story, and then we'll get into where people can find you.
Yeah, I actually did reread it yesterday, and it's still because it's been a few years since I last read it. So of course I wanted to reread it to have it fresher in my mind. And I think the first time I read it, it was just okay. This is totally not what I expected, but the more you reread it, I think the better it gets. And I still find it hard to imagine that this was her first pro-published story.
I know, it's insane
because it's so polished, and also that an unmarried 22 or 23-year-old bank clerk wrote this very, very, very erotic, sexually and because it says sex metaphors, addiction metaphors. That's not what you would expect a 23-year-old bank clerk in the 1930s to write. So, of course, people did have sex in the 1930s. They had premarital sex, and also she was engaged to this guy who killed himself or accidentally shot himself. We don't know what really happened to him. But it's an. But
it's call C.L. Moore the grandmother of tentacle porn. Okay.
Yeah, probably. The Japanese probably got to it before. There are Japanese woodcuts of what we would call tentacle porn, which are older than this story.
Yeah, it's so funny too. Well, yeah, I don't know if we're ever going to get to the who invented tentacle porn. However, but I will say, yeah, this was really racy stuff for the era, but then again, like I think that's our looking back on it, because
we normally don't try to think about it, but then I thought, okay, like she's almost the age of my grandmothers. One grandmother was a bit younger, the other was a bit older. She's the age of my grandmothers, so that's And my grandmothers definitely knew what sex was.
See, a lot of this in my head, because my father died in his 80s and he was born in 1936. So I kept thinking this was 3 years before my dad was born, and which is just mind-boggling to think about how long ago it was. But since this whole series is about the 1930s sci-fi, it's important to remember the 30s was a radical decade. There was a lot of radical stuff going on in the 30s.
The reason they had to, in the movies, there's a reason why they had to bring in the Hays Code.
Yeah.
Because the movie,
They were racy.
the pre-code movies show you what the 30s were really like more than the post-Hays Code movies, you know.
Yeah, they were really, the early ones are really, the early 30s were, the movies were racy, and also a lot of the pulps, they get more state after 1940 or late 30s. There was some kind of censorship change, but the pulps, depending on which one you read, but no, it's not just the spicy pulps which were racy. The spicy pulps are just mostly kind of weird in some ways, because it's like, okay, we can't write about actual sex, but so the women are rising orgasmically while they are. My favorite, I think, is the one where a woman is it's described how she shivers and rises orgasmically as she's executed in the electric chair. Okay, maybe that's not the way you should do it, but it's just weird. But Weird Tales is pretty erotic for its era.
It's true. Well, Cora, everyone can tell from hearing you talk that you take the history of science fiction very, very seriously. Tell the folks where you write about it, so they can follow your work.
You can find me at corabuhlert.com, CoraBuhlert.com, which is my main blog, and where I also review where I talk about TV shows, movies, science fiction awards, anything that comes to mind, and also occasional review. Should get back to that because it sort of fell off the wagon because life happened. Also review old 1930s and 1940s science fiction stories on occasion, including some C.L. Moore stories. And yes,
and you take very seriously promoting the fan writer, which right now we just lost the Alexei
Pension. Yes, he was the first, I think, who actually won the fan writer.
Yeah,
Hugo.
and you always do great work promoting those of us who do fan writing and amateur scholar work.
The fan Hugos are, I think, important because and a lot of people just ignore them and just focus on best novel, best dramatic presentation long, if they can actually remember the name, and then it's like, but they forget the fan categories and the editing categories, which are also really important.
Yes, very.
Yes, okay. I'm actually a finalist, and this time, not this time, but next week we'll know whether I won or not. Not because I'm a best fan writer finalist this year, which is why I have my three rockets.
You're not going to Chicago? You're going to be?
No, sadly not.
Me neither.
Pandemic and life happened. So I will be there virtually. I'll be sitting here in the middle of the night in an evening gown with a tiara and wondering whether I will get to give the speech I wrote, or I have to write because I haven't written it yet. And yeah, so you can also find me at galacticjourney.org, which is a science fiction fanzine. It's like any other science fiction fanzine. We cover science news, we cover books, magazines, movies, TV shows, but 55 years in the past. So it's 1967 now. It's a summer of love, which in Germany actually was not a summer of love, but a summer of pretty terrible riots happening, and people and police violence.
Have you heard about Galactic Journey, Greg? Yeah. Have you heard about this before? Galactic Journey?
I was just right.
You should check us out. We're great. It's a great.
Yeah, it was started by a local for me.
Yeah, it's our founder Gideon Marcus is from San Diego, just like David, and I think you know each other. You've met.
Yeah. We've tabled
in
before.
person. I mean.
Yeah. We've sold books together.
And he's great. It was also a Hugo finalist this year, and one of our writers is a fan artist finalist, Lorelei Esther. She's the daughter of Gideon and Janice, and she's a fan artist finalist and the youngest Hugo finalist ever that we know of. She's 18. The earliest youngest was, I think, Robert Silverberg, who was 20.
Greg, you would be really, so last year, because they always cover, Galactic Journey always covers 55 years in the past. They
Star Trek started last year, and it starts up again next month.
Yeah, and they do the Star Trek episodes with the original commercials. And
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they have a stream. They have a live stream of Star Trek, which I never get to watch simply because it happens in the middle of the night, and you'll say, "Okay, no, I'm not in the mood to watch Star Trek at 3 a.m." But you can go there. They have a standing invite link. I think you can they also have some friends over in person at the home to watch Star
yeah,
Trek.
I've thought about doing that because it's in town here, and I did want to go for Balance of Terror, my favorite episode, but I didn't. And so alas, we're into season 2 now, I think.
Yeah, Amok Time should start. Season 2 starts sometimes next year. Next month.
The fact that they watch it with the original commercials is just awesome.
Yeah, they cut in original. Well, it's probably but it's period commercial. It's any rate, it's commercials from the period that might have run during Star Trek.
Okay.
I don't know if it's really the original ones which ran there. And also you get to see the stuff which ran before Star Trek, which is some kind of Daniel Boone or something, the Western show.
That's awesome. Greg, your work.
Well, this is the point where I can't resist bragging about the fact that as of now, I am officially a Weird Tales author.
Oh, yeah,
that's right. I have a story in the very next issue of Weird Tales, Weird Tales number 366, which I believe is coming out imminently, and which is in fact, official sword and sorcery issue. And I wrote I think of it as a classic sort of Robert E. Howard, C.L. Moore sword and sorcery story with a twist, Guardians of the Sapphire Sword. Okay, that will be in, Weird Tales 366, which I believe is coming out like shortly. I don't know the exact pub date.
I know you can order it already. So.
Yeah, you can.
I've seen the cover at any rate advertised.
Yes, with Bob Eggleton. And yeah, I am chuffed beyond all reason, beyond the fact that, hey, I made a sale. Hey, publication. There's, oh, wow. Bucket list, I get to be a Weird Tales author now. Along the same line, I've been writing a lot of stuff for short stories recently. I've been writing regularly for the official Star Trek Explorer magazine. I have a story in the current issue, now on sale, which is a story about Khan Noonien Singh, my first Khan story in 17 years. And I just recently, we had a successful Kickstarter. I am going to have a story in Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2022, edited by Bob Greenberger. And yeah, my story, this is supposed to be old-fashioned pulp stories is the idea, is in fact a swashbuckling sword and sorcery, very Robert E. Howard-esque story about a female barbarian swordswoman. So thank you, C.L. Moore. Okay, a little bit of Gyrell, a little bit of E. Howard. So yeah, so I've got actually 2 sword and sorcery old-fashioned Weird Tales sword and sorcery stories coming out. I think Thrilling Adventure Yarns comes out around January. I actually got the check yesterday. Weird Tales comes out imminently. And in the meantime, I've been sort of writing fairly regularly for the Star Trek Explorer magazine. I think I have a story in issue 5, which is—
I read your board one, the 7 of 9 one. It was very good. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I had a story about 7 of 9 in issue 2. I had a Khan story in issue 3. And I think I have a story, I don't know if it's in 4 or 5, and I'm not sure I can reveal it, but it's a TNG era story coming out soon. So that's been fun.
Yeah, and your last Trek novel was a Bones one, right? Was a McCoy novel?
Back in November 2020, yes, it was Contest of Principles. And yes, it was my love letter to Dr. McCoy, since I realized that, oh my God, I'd never written a Bones-centric Star Trek novel before. So I wanted to give McCoy some love. So he gets his own solo adventure while Kirk and Spock are occupied elsewhere. Okay.
Awesome. Well, Greg, I appreciate your time. I'm glad you were able to finish moving out your storage unit in order to have time to do this today, because I know that was the issue. And my buddy Even Zorik was going to fill in and then had like massive migraines last night. And so it just worked out that we were able to switch it back.
My heart goes out to him, but I'm glad. I almost, I wonder, it's kind of last minute. I thought we were going to be tied up this week. It turns out I have Sunday free. Let's see if there's still an opening. Oh, well, how about that? Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to have you here. I'm bummed we couldn't have a 4th chair, but I I'm sure even stoked that he read C.L. Moore anyways, because I think it was new to him. Yeah, and coming up next in this series, if all goes as planned, will be Rule 18 by Clifford Samac, and with guests Alec Neville-Lee, the author of Astounding, and Seth Heasley, co-host of the Hugo's There podcast. So we'll see you next time for Rule 18. Thanks for joining us, folks, and have a good one.